Alright, so for this book club, we're going to be going over the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, one of the founding documents of the modern interpretation of Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, and essentially these are the notes that I have made as I have read this book of the core themes of the book and the core tenets of his philosophy. Essentially in the messages that he puts out in the most crucial parts of the book. So let's get into it. So in his meditations, Marcus Aurelius says that you should have good morals and govern your temper. He states that manliness, piety, abstinence, loyalty, and simple living are virtues, and public schools should be discouraged. So you can clearly see some aspects of the Homerian myth in there, talking about piety. If you've ever read the Odyssey or the Iliad, you'll know that that's one of the key features of Greek heroes, the war between piety and vanity. So Aurelius says that you should endure labour, want little, and you should not accept slander. So essentially, if you're a good man living the Stoic way, you shouldn't accept slander because you do not deserve it. Aurelius says that you should endure freedom of speech and love philosophy. Because obviously he was the essentially the philosophy emperor, and where he says endure freedom of speech there, that's quite interesting because we know a lot of the great generals and emperors of antiquity commonly had a similar constitution to this. So, off the top of my head, Pyrrhus of Epirus was a phenomenally famous Greek general, cousin of Alexander the Great, and I believe there's a story where in his city there were some people talking essentially rubbish about him, trying to attack his character to others, and his guards essentially just asked him, "Oh, should we exile them, sir?" And Pyrrhus says, "No, I would rather have them saying these things in my kingdom instead of spreading them around for the world to hear." So that's essentially what that means and how it can be put into context. Do not be full of yourself, easily forgive those whom deserve it, and read carefully. So these are more tenets of the hard work aspect of Stoicism. Use your free will and work towards your purpose. Do not be humbled by favours, however, do not let them go unnoticed. And this is part of the part of his philosophy that really makes a man. You don't want to be bending over backwards every time someone does you a favour, because it makes you look weak, and most people really don't like it if you're overly humble. But they also don't like it if you just act as though their favour has gone unnoticed. So show that you're grateful and accept it with goodwill, I would say. So be tolerant to other opinions in an argument, and be free from passion in your speech, while simultaneously possessing knowledge without ostentation. So essentially, don't be full of yourself, listen to what others have to say in an argument, and be driven by reason. Don't just let your emotions take over if you're having a fierce argument and you believe that you're vehemently right. You have to make concessions if the other side makes rational arguments that you can't really obfuscate. So, with regards to politics, Marcus Aurelius says that politicians are deficient in paternal affection, so we shouldn't really be considering our great leaders as father figures, because they really do not perceive the governed to be like that. It's quite interesting, really, when you think about that, because the attitudes of deference uh, would have still been rife at the time. They didn't really end until the Industrial Revolution. So the idea, well, I suppose it wouldn't be in the Enlightenment English sense, but you would still have some deference to authority in these early societies. So, Marcus Aurelius says that you should not be indifferent when friends find faults in your character, and love thy kin, truth, and justice. So essentially, uh, accept flaws within yourself and aspire to your utmost potential. So Aurelius supported formal equality under the law, freedom of speech, and the prospect of a night watchman state, because he didn't really have much influence on stuff like the economy or ordinary people's lives during his reign, so he preferred a more of a minarchist state, but it wasn't a full minarchist state. So Aurelius encourages people to partake in self-government, cheerfulness, and working without complaint. So you can see that's very stoic. You can see why Stoicism was a common philosophy adopted by those in the gulags during the Soviet Union, because if you're working as hard as you can and you're forced to do that, well, you might as well just do it without complaining, if there's nothing you can do. And even if you're working towards some ultimate goal, you shouldn't really be complaining on the way there. It's just a waste of time. You might as well spend that extra time working. And with regards to the part on self-government, it's a bit like rational anarchism. So adhere to the laws that you personally deem to be moral and just. The state should not be the arbiter of morality. You are an individual moral legislator. And obviously think about ancient Rome and the power that the plebs, so the plebeians, had over the government, in the sense that they could partake in a secession of the plebs, where they would leave the city and essentially leave all of the aristocrats without labour. It's pretty much the early ideas of trade unionism. So, he instructs a man to be good to his friends, but do not be too extravagant with your affections, because obviously if you're going to, like, have a friend and you're constantly giving them presents or going, oh, I'll lend you the money for that, well, it's going to mean that your friend isn't really going to like you as much, because whenever he sees you, he's constantly going to be thinking like, oh, he's going to buy me something or lend me money, and I will, because he's doing this in his goodwill, I don't really want to disappoint them by not being able to repay it, and I feel as though if I'm constantly taking loans from my friends, you're not really on an equal footing. There's a power dynamic based on money. So some of the themes that George Orwell puts forward in his book Keep the Aspidistra Flying, where he refuses to take any money from his wealthier friends, because that means he won't be their friend anymore. Just interesting to consider. So, endure blame for your mistakes, keep few secrets, and look at what ought to be done, and do it. Do not care for the reputation you will gain from such work. Live according to nature. Obviously, that's a very integral part of Stoicism. If you think about one of the earliest Stoics, Diogenes, who spent his entire life living, well, most of his life, living in a wine barrel with the dogs, with his only possession being a bowl, until he realized that he had been very frivolous and extravagant with his spending on such a bowl when he saw a child drinking from the stream where he got water with his hands cupped. So Diogenes immediately threw away the bowl so he could better live in nature without such extravagant pieces of equipment. So, learn new things, but do not become obsessed with these things, for you shall waste time. Pretty much self-explanatory. Focus on the key and core parts of your life. It's a bit like what Ted Kaczynski talks about in his book Industrial Society and Its Future, where he talks about how time is always divided between fulfilling the physical requirements and the extra time which is usually spent on some other activity that is superfluous to your survival. So you don't really want to be wasting all your time on like a hobby, do you? So death is just an operation of nature, so it should not be feared. You cannot lose the past nor the future as you do not possess them. All is opinion. So essentially he's saying there that he believes that everything is subjective. Wait for death with a cheerful mind. Nothing is evil which is according to nature. And do not think of others unless it is a thought of others. Unless it is a thought which is according to nature, So essentially these are the core tenets of why Marcus Aurelius and other Stoics believe that living according to nature is fundamentally important to a good life. Well, a virtuous life, really. So, do not labour unwillingly, and do not be busy with too many things. Do nothing that needs walls nor curtains. So essentially, do not be virtuous in the private sphere while presenting a false front of virtue in the public sphere. So essentially, make sure you've got no skeletons in the closet, that you're completely and utterly transparent, and there's no way for your reputation to be denigrated by lacking virtue in your private life. So be satisfied with your present activity and stick to your principles. Once again, similar to rational anarchism, talking about being an individual moral legislator. The universe is transformation, and thus the organic nature of common law is of utmost importance. So that shows how Marcus Aurelius supports common law as it arises from a gradual change over time, like the notion put forth by Edmund Burke in his reflections on the Revolution in France. So, while you live, be good, you shall not live forever. Do what is necessary and what is the social animal... do what is necessary and what the social animal requires. So fulfill your obligations, that essentially means, and ensure that all of the physical demands of life are met. So essentially companionship, fraternity, making sure you've got a roof over your head and food. So he goes on to say, remove the superfluous acts and thoughts, so those that are unnecessary. Love the arts you have learned and be content with them. So don't always be feeling anxious that, oh, I don't really know about this stuff, so I'll be content when I've mastered my knowledge of this. And obviously once you finish, you put the focus on something else, and that continues, and then you'll die living quite a sad life where you think that you're always going to be happy after you achieve the next big thing. Obviously you won't. As soon as you achieve it, you move the goalposts further, which is a good thing, but if you want to live a happy life, it's not very happiness-inducing, I'll put it. So, men cannot enjoy the sharpness of thy wit. So, obviously, if you're being quite witty and insulting someone with a witty comeback, they're not going to enjoy it, even though what you said is really clever. So maybe you might as well say something clever yourself and actually give them some decent advice. Do your duty, and from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So partaking in the duty of social obligations. So while some people have interpreted this as him in promoting some kind of Socratic communist ideal, because obviously it's similar to the prospects put forth in Plato in the Republic, I would argue that Marcus Aurelius is more talking about the duty of an individual to provide for his countrymen and ensure that they are not living in squalor. So it's more an appeal to honour as an appeal to some kind of moral obligation to provide for someone. I mean, you shouldn't have to, and it's wrong if it is just taken away from you without your consent, so through excruciating taxation, but it would be thought of that it is the honourable thing to do to ensure that your countrymen are living in adequate conditions and they are not impoverished. So, do all as a discipline of Antoninus. So this essentially means he wants you to act like he does, because Antoninus was his own mentor. And obviously a lot of people do. I mean, I think Stoicism is personally one of the better philosophies that you can embrace. It does push away quite a lot of happiness, but if you want to get stuff done in your life, Stoicism is probably the way there, but unfortunately, if you do embrace its path, your life probably won't be remarkably exciting, but I digress. So, all is eventually forgotten, and whatever anyone says, I must be good. So essentially, he's saying, don't care about what others think of you, because whatever they say is going to be forgotten in the long run. So if they're like talking bad about you, just make sure that you're being good, because you are actually being good, and even if you're forgotten in the future, you are still a good man, in spite of what other people thought. So the prospect of eudaimonia is a good thing, but I must also live in the present. So that essentially means that spending your whole life working to the point where you die and then you're on your deathbed and thinking, wow, I've completed everything I wanted to do. I've got all the work I've needed to do done. I wasn't lazy in my life. I was working all the time, and now I'm going to die and just be dead. So he thinks that's a good thing, but it essentially pushes the desires of the individual into the future. And essentially, if you're constantly thinking like, oh, I need to get this work done, so I'm being horrible to everyone around me, and then in the future, you're on your deathbed and you're like, well, I got it done, so that was good, but I mean, you never lived in the present, so you never got to be a part of society, really. You didn't really have a social function. So, seeking fame is pointless, as it will soon be overshadowed by future stars. So that's self-explanatory. Everyone should act according to their own constitution, once again referring to the ideas of self-government. Do not yield to temptations of the body, so essentially avoid hedonism. Pain is never tolerable, nor everlasting. Ergo, Epicurus' hedonism is foolish. For those who don't know, Epicurus was a famous Greek philosopher who supported hedonism. So, Live every day as if it were your last and avoid hypocrisy, so don't be a hypocrite. Remove the desire of empty fame and do not care about how you seem to others. So that's similar to the first bullet point that we went over. It doesn't matter what others think, just be a good person, essentially. Do no act which you shall regret in the future. Confine your desires to what are in your power to achieve. Do not be vexed by stupid people. There's another Pyrrhus of Epirus story here. Yeah, he was talking about how he wanted to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and go on a great conquest. And then at the end of this conquest, he was talking to his generals, and they were saying, so why are we doing this? Why are we going to conquer all these lands? And he goes, oh, because at the end of it, we're going to be able to retire and drink wine all day, eat great food, and enjoy great shows in our home. And then they say, well, why are we going on a conquest then? You already have lots of money, you can do that already. And in response to this, Pyrrhus is essentially just annoyed with them. He doesn't have any of them executed, because Pyrrhus of Epirus is a pretty good guy. Carl Benjamin did a good video on Pyrrhus, if you're interested. But yeah, it's just essentially avoiding being vexed by people too much, so focus on yourself. It is in human nature to get up out of bed, so don't be lazy. Think of what values are held by the men you meet, and use plain discourse, and only the present can pain thee. So don't really worry about the past too much if you've made mistakes. Just keep looking to the future and try and learn from the past what you can to avoid present pain. So now we're on our last slide. And we're just going to go over the last few bullet points. Truth is the universal nature. Do not be afraid of pain and do not pursue pleasure. So once again, avoid hedonism and embrace rationalism. Not the Cartesian sense, though. Be content with death. Man is a social creature, so you must be contented with your ruling faculty. So once again, Ted Kaczynski talks about this in his book Industrial Society and Its Future, where he talks about the difference between where he talks about the power process, which is essentially the process by which individuals get power from a society, so usually from hard work or in other people. So for the people who work hard, essentially like the idea of Friedrich Nietzsche's power over oneself, and for those who don't work hard, it takes place in a power over others, or a desire for it. Be content with what you have, and be a reasonable being. All things change into one another. Everything changes, everything dies. What does not harm law does not harm the state. I've just put, is this true? Because essentially if it undermines the rule of law, then it could undermine the legitimacy of the state, as it suggests that it is not representative of the will of the people. However, this is overcome by the fact that Marcus Aurelius supports common law over binding statute from the legislature. So tragedy is a part of nature. Embrace your nature and don't be angry at the men of vice, for such men shall always exist in nature, so they must be tolerated, which essentially just means that if there are going to be people living hedonistically, don't be too annoyed by them. They're always going to be there. They're always going to get nothing done. You can't really do much, so just focus on yourself. To be moved by passion is not manly, but mildness and gentleness is manly. You should not be surprised by anything. Expect all and nothing will come as a surprise. Consider that all is opinion. Termination of life is not always evil, as it is sometimes necessary. Cast away opinion and you are saved. So once again, focus on yourself. Do not care what others think. Just briefly, this idea has a lot to do with the social contract, which would be elaborated on by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the future on his book, The Social Contract, where he talks about how people act differently based on how they believe society perceives them. So essentially why people act one way when they are in their bedroom and another way while they are in like a crowded area full of people. It's essentially the separation between the public and private spheres, like we went over earlier. There is one soul divided among all, so this similar belief to Hinduism. We know they had some knowledge of Hinduism at the time, probably quite a lot. I remember Cicero had an interesting account of India, particularly the supposed dog-headed men, but that's something that you can get into on your own. And what is unjust, do not do. What is untruthful, do not say. And I believe that is self-explanatory, and it is still very relevant to the modern day. So, that was the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, one of the most important works of philosophy that comes from antiquity, and we have access to in the modern day. I hope you enjoyed Book Club number 3. Goodbye.